Here in the quiet of Breathitt County, the story of Patsey Troxdale still hangs in the air like the fog behind me. In 1958, her 8-year-old daughter was taken from this hollow.
Between September 4th and October 12th, 1928, 16 men disappeared across eastern Kentucky during investigation into child trafficking ring that had operated throughout Appalachian region for 3 years, kidnapping children from isolated homesteads and selling them to adoption brokers in distant cities, where desperate couples paid thousands of dollars for babies and young children whose families had been told their offspring had died in accidents or had run away never to be found. By October 20th, all 16 were dead, their bodies discovered in locations deliberately chosen to mark every house, barn and meeting place where trafficking ring had held stolen children before transporting them to buyers, where gang members had celebrated successful kidnappings with whiskey and cards, while parents searched desperately for sons and daughters who'd vanished without trace. The perpetrator was Patsey Troxdale, 36-year-old mother, whose 8-year-old daughter Emma had been kidnapped September 1st, 1928, from family homestead in Harlan County, while Patsey had been working in garden 50 yards away, who'd spent 3 days searching before discovering that local Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb was leader of trafficking ring that had stolen Emma and 17 other children over previous 3 years, selling them to adoption brokers who'd paid Webb and his associates approximately $5,000 per child for healthy youngsters who could be placed with wealthy families desperate for children they couldn't conceive naturally. The Kentucky State Police would classify it as deadliest attack on organized crime in state history, unprecedented case where single woman had systematically eliminated entire criminal network through campaign requiring tactical planning and sustained violence that authorities had failed to accomplish despite 3 years of investigating child disappearances they'd attributed to runaways or accidents, rather than recognizing patterns suggesting organized kidnapping operation. But motive wasn't simple revenge or vigilante justice. It was mother delivering protection that law enforcement had failed to provide, proving that maternal rage exceeded any violence men could imagine when defending children. That woman whose daughter had been stolen would hunt every participant in trafficking ring, regardless of whether they were criminals or corrupt deputies who'd betrayed public trust by selling children for profit. If you're ready to hear how Kentucky Reaper became deadliest woman in state criminal history, systematically butchering 16 men who'd kidnapped her daughter, hit that subscribe button. But understand this story contains dramatized account of systematic violence against organized crime network and corrupt law enforcement during 1920s when child trafficking was epidemic throughout Appalachia and when legal remedies were inadequate to protect families from gangs that stole children and sold them to distant buyers. Harlan County, Kentucky occupied 470 square miles of coal country and mountain hollows in 1928. Populated by 75,000 people, mostly working mines or struggling with poverty, as coal industry declined from 1920's peak. Families living in isolated homesteads connected by rough roads that made law enforcement coverage nearly impossible, and that created opportunities for criminal enterprises operating beyond reach of authorities who lacked resources and often corruption to combat organized crime. September 1928 meant temperatures dropping into 50s at night, harvest season when families gathered crops that would sustain them through winter, children helping with farm work, while parents managed heavier tasks requiring adult strength. The county was notorious for violence and lawlessness, coal company wars and union conflicts having created atmosphere where murders were common and where authorities were often complicit in criminal activities that generated more income than legitimate employment could provide. Patsey Troxdale had lived in Harlan County since birth in 1892, married at 17 to coal miner Thomas Troxdale, who died in mine collapse in 1924, raised 3 children alone on homestead, where she grew vegetables and raised chickens, while taking in laundry from miners' families to supplement income that barely covered necessities. Her daughter Emma was 8 years old in 1928, youngest of 3 children, bright girl who helped mother with household chores and who attended one-room schoolhouse 2 miles from homestead when weather permitted travel and when family could spare her labor from farm work. Patsey had protective maternal instincts intensified by losing husband to mine accident, watched children carefully, and kept them close to Homestead. Understood that isolated mountain families were vulnerable to dangers that authorities couldn't prevent, and that parents needed to maintain constant vigilance to protect offspring from threats both natural and human. The kidnapping occurred September 1st, while Patsey worked in garden behind house, Emma playing in yard visible from where mother was pulling weeds. Routine afternoon that seemed safe because Homestead was isolated and because Patsey could see daughter from work location. But sometime between 3 and 4 in afternoon, while Patsey's attention was focused on garden, Emma vanished without sound or struggle. Disappeared so completely that Patsey didn't realize child was missing until she looked up and found yard empty. Called Emma's name repeatedly while searching property and surrounding woods, felt rising panic when daughter didn't respond, and when no trace could be found suggesting where 8-year-old had gone. Patsey searched until darkness made continuing impossible, recruited neighbors to help expand search throughout night, contacted Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb, requesting law enforcement assistance finding missing child. Webb arrived at Homestead September 2nd morning, questioned Patsey about Emma's disappearance, suggested that child had probably wandered into woods and gotten lost, that searchers would likely find her within a day or two. Once organized search parties could cover area systematically. But Webb's demeanor was wrong. He seemed unconcerned about missing child, asked fewer questions than Patsey expected from law enforcement investigating child's disappearance, left after brief visit without organizing search parties he'd mentioned, or without deploying resources that desperate mother believed should be mobilized immediately to find 8-year-old who'd been missing overnight. Patsey continued searching September 2nd and 3rd, organized community volunteers who covered miles of mountain terrain looking for signs of Emma, found nothing suggesting where child had gone or what had happened to her. The complete absence of evidence was itself suspicious. Emma hadn't taken clothes or food suggesting she'd run away. No torn fabric or disturbed ground indicated she'd been attacked by animals. No witness reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles near Homestead on afternoon of disappearance. The situation suggested something worse than accidental wandering or animal attack, implied that Emma had been taken deliberately by someone who'd planned kidnapping carefully enough to leave no trace that searchers could follow. Patsey's suspicions about Webb intensified when she learned from neighbors on September 3rd that 17 other children had disappeared from Harlan County over previous 3 years, vanishings that authorities had attributed to runaways or accidents without conducting thorough investigations or recognizing patterns suggesting organized kidnapping operation. The pattern was unmistakable once Patsey examined details. Children between ages 4 and 10 had vanished from isolated homesteads while parents were working, disappeared without struggles or traces. Cases had been closed quickly by deputies who'd suggested runaways or accidents without evidence supporting those conclusions. The similarities convinced Patsey that Emma's disappearance was connected to previous kidnappings, that organized gang was operating in Harlan County, stealing children for purposes she didn't want to imagine, but that certainly involved something more sinister than random crimes of opportunity. Patsey confronted Webb September 4th, demanded to know why he hadn't investigated similarities between Emma's disappearance and previous child vanishings, asked why no resources were being devoted to finding her daughter when 17 other families had lost children under identical circumstances. Webb's response was dismissive and threatening. He told Patsey that questioning law enforcement's competence was unwise, that parents who made trouble for deputies often found themselves facing charges or losing custody of remaining children, that she should focus on caring for 2 sons still at home rather than pursuing theories about organized kidnapping that had no evidence supporting them. The threat was barely concealed, warning that Webb had power to destroy Patsey's family if she continued investigating Emma's disappearance. But Webb's threat convinced Patsey that he was involved in Emma's kidnapping, that his dismissive attitude and threatening response meant he had personal interest in preventing investigation that might expose organized operation. Patsey made decision that evening that she would find Emma herself and would deliver justice to everyone involved in kidnapping, regardless of whether they were criminals or corrupt deputies who'd betrayed public trust. She began surveillance of Webb immediately, following him during off-duty hours, documenting where he went and who he met, gradually understanding that Deputy Sheriff was leader of trafficking ring that had been stealing children and selling them to adoption brokers who paid thousands of dollars for healthy youngsters. Patsey's investigation over next 72 hours revealed criminal enterprise that explained 17 previous disappearances and Emma's kidnapping. Webb led gang of 15 associates, including 4 other deputies, 2 coal company guards and 9 unemployed miners who worked as kidnappers and transporters, moving stolen children from Harlan County to buyers in distant cities. The operation was sophisticated. Gang members would identify isolated homesteads with young children, surveil families to learn routines and vulnerabilities, strike when parents were distracted by farm work or household tasks, transport children immediately to safe houses where they'd be held until adoption brokers could arrange sales. The adoption brokers paid approximately $5,000 per child to couples desperate for babies and young children, told buyers that children were orphans or had been surrendered by mothers who couldn't care for them, concealed that youngsters had actually been stolen from families who'd been told their missing children had probably run away or had died in accidents that left no bodies to bury. Patsey discovered that Emma was being held in an abandoned farmhouse 12 miles from Homestead, location where Webb's gang kept kidnapped children before transporting them to buyers. She approached farmhouse September 7th at dawn, armed with hunting rifle and determination that maternal rage had forged into weapon more dangerous than any man could wield when defending children. 2 gang members were guarding farmhouse, men who'd participated in Emma's kidnapping and who'd celebrated successful operation with whiskey, while 8-year-old girl cried for mother she'd been stolen from. Patsey shot both guards without warning or mercy, systematic violence that eliminated threats before they could respond or call for backup, entered farmhouse to find Emma and 3 other recently kidnapped children locked in upstairs bedroom. Emma was terrified but physically unharmed, had been held 4 days while gang waited for adoption broker to arrange buyer who'd pay $5,000 for healthy 8-year-old girl. Patsey gathered all 4 children, drove them to county courthouse, where she demanded Kentucky State Police investigate Webb and his associates for operating child trafficking ring. State Police initially dismissed Patsey's accusations, believed Deputy Sheriff's denials that he was involved in criminal enterprise, suggested that Patsey had found Emma wandering in woods and had fabricated kidnapping story to explain daughter's absence. But when State Police interviewed other rescued children and their families, pattern became unmistakable. All had been kidnapped under identical circumstances, all identified members of Webb's gang as their abductors, all described being held at farmhouse that Patsey had raided. State Police arrested Webb and 4 deputy sheriffs September 8th, charged them with kidnapping and conspiracy, requested that prosecutor file charges against remaining 11 gang members once they could be located and apprehended. But prosecutor was reluctant to pursue case aggressively because Webb had political connections throughout Harlan County, because convicting deputy sheriffs of kidnapping would damage department's reputation, because trials would expose that law enforcement had been complicit in trafficking operation that had stolen 18 children over 3 years. Prosecutor suggested that evidence against Webb was insufficient for conviction, that Patsey's testimony about finding children at farmhouse might have been fabricated, that state should accept guilty pleas to lesser charges rather than pursuing kidnapping prosecutions that might fail, and that would generate negative publicity about corrupt deputies. Patsey understood immediately that justice system would fail, that prosecutor wanted to protect Webb and his associates rather than holding them accountable for trafficking ring that had stolen children and destroyed families. She made decision September 9th that systematic elimination of everyone involved in Emma's kidnapping was only response that would protect other families from gang that would continue operating if members weren't permanently removed. She spent next week identifying all 16 participants in trafficking ring, researched their locations and routines, created targeting plan that would eliminate every member beginning with those most directly responsible for kidnapping operations and proceeding through everyone who'd participated in stealing children and selling them to distant buyers. Patsey's advantages were combination of maternal rage and mountain skills, capabilities that made her deadlier than gang members anticipated when dismissing her as grieving mother who'd gotten lucky rescuing daughter. She'd grown up hunting in Kentucky mountains, understood tracking and stalking techniques that translated perfectly to hunting humans who'd stolen children, possessed determination and focus that sustained violence exceeding anything criminals expected from woman whose daughter had been returned safely. Most significantly, she understood that gang members would underestimate her based on gender stereotypes about women's capacity for systematic violence, that their assumption she'd be satisfied with Emma's safe return would make them vulnerable to attacks they'd never anticipated from mother whose protective instincts had transformed into offensive campaign against everyone who'd participated in trafficking ring. The systematic elimination began September 10th, when gang member Carl Mitchell, who'd been Emma's primary abductor, was found dead at his home, shot multiple times in attack, suggesting rage beyond simple execution, maternal fury that had been unleashed against man who'd stolen an 8-year-old girl and had celebrated successful kidnapping, while child cried for mother. Mitchell's death sent message that rescuing Emma hadn't satisfied Patsey's need for justice, that every participant in trafficking ring would face consequences that law enforcement had failed to deliver when prosecutor had suggested accepting guilty pleas to lesser charges rather than pursuing full accountability. Additional gang members died September 12th, 14th and 16th, systematic violence that demonstrated Patsey could strike anywhere, despite gangs' defensive preparations after recognizing pattern. 2 coal company guards who'd helped surveil potential kidnapping targets were killed September 18th during shift change, ambushed by shooter positioned on ridge overlooking mine entrance, tactical planning that required knowledge of routines and vulnerabilities that Patsey had acquired through surveillance. 3 unemployed miners who'd worked as transporters, moving stolen children to safe houses, died September 21st when their meeting at local tavern was interrupted by armed woman, who shot all 3 before anyone could draw weapons or escape. Brazen attack that demonstrated Patsey's confidence and willingness to strike in populated locations, despite risks of being identified or captured. Deputy sheriffs involved in trafficking ring died September 25th through 28th. Systematic elimination of corrupt law enforcement officers who'd betrayed public trust by stealing children and selling them to adoption brokers. Marcus Webb was killed September 28th, shot while leaving courthouse, where he'd been released on bail pending trial for kidnapping charges that prosecutor had been reluctant to pursue aggressively. Webb's death eliminated leader of trafficking ring, demonstrated that badges provided no protection against mother whose daughter had been stolen, that Patsey would hunt every participant in criminal enterprise, regardless of whether they were common criminals or corrupt deputies who'd used law enforcement positions to facilitate kidnapping operations. By October 5th, 14 gang members were dead. State police had deployed investigators throughout Harlan County, attempting to locate and protect remaining 2 members while solving murders that everyone suspected were connected to child trafficking ring. But investigators couldn't identify perpetrator, despite strong suspicions that Patsey was responsible for systematic elimination campaign, had no witnesses placing her at murder scenes, had no physical evidence connecting her to weapons used in killings, couldn't prove that mother who'd rescued daughter was same person who'd been hunting gang members with military-style precision. Patsey maintained normal public appearances throughout investigation, attended church services and community gatherings where she'd expressed appropriate horror about violence while secretly continuing campaign that would eliminate every person who'd participated in Emma's kidnapping. The final 2 gang members were killed, October 10th and 12th, coordinated attacks that demonstrated Patsey's capability for complex operations, requiring multiple strikes at different locations. Last member was adoption broker named Robert Harrison, who'd arranged sales of stolen children to wealthy couples in distant cities, man who'd profited most from trafficking ring by collecting fees from both gang that supplied children and couples who purchased them. Harrison was killed October 12th at train station, where he'd been attempting to flee Kentucky, after recognizing that everyone involved in trafficking operation had been systematically eliminated, shot by sniper positioned in building overlooking platform, final death that completed Patsey's campaign against everyone who'd participated in Emma's kidnapping. Kentucky State Police investigation continued through October and November. Hundreds interviewed, evidence examined, attempts made to connect Patsey to 16 murders that authorities suspected she'd committed but couldn't prove without witnesses or physical evidence. Patsey maintained perfect composure during interrogations, never wavered from position that she'd been focused on caring for Emma and recovering from trauma of kidnapping, that she'd been home with children during periods when murders had occurred, that she knew nothing about systematic elimination campaign beyond what she'd read in newspapers reporting gang members' deaths. Her performance was masterful demonstration of woman's capability for deception when protecting family, ability to maintain grieving mother persona while concealing tactical sophistication that had enabled elimination of 16 men through 6-week campaign. Investigation collapsed in December 1928 when prosecutors acknowledged they couldn't develop case-meeting evidentiary standards for prosecution. That circumstantial connection between Patsey and murders wasn't sufficient for conviction when physical evidence and witnesses were absent. That Kentucky Reaper, nickname that had emerged for perpetrator, who'd systematically butchered 16 men involved in child trafficking, had executed campaign so carefully that proving identity beyond reasonable doubt would be impossible. The outcome meant Patsey would never be prosecuted, despite being widely known throughout Harlan County as mother who'd eliminated everyone involved in daughter's kidnapping, that she'd spend remaining years as free woman protected by lack of evidence and by community's collective judgment, that her violence had been justified response to criminal enterprise that had stolen children and corrupted law enforcement. Patsey Troxdale recovered gradually from kidnapping trauma through support of mother, who'd proven that maternal protection exceeded any threat children might face. That woman defending offspring possessed capabilities that no criminal gang could match, regardless of their organization or corrupt law enforcement support. The trafficking ring's elimination meant no children were subsequently kidnapped from Harlan County. Families understood that stealing youngsters carried consequences that badges couldn't protect against when mothers decided systematic violence was appropriate response to threats against children. Patsey's campaign had succeeded where legal system had failed, had protected community through violence that authorities had been unwilling or unable to deliver when prosecutor had preferred protecting corrupt deputies over holding them accountable for trafficking operation. Patsey Troxdale lived quietly on Homestead through subsequent decades, devoted herself to raising 3 children and maintaining property where Emma had been kidnapped, and where mother's protective instincts had been transformed into offensive campaign against everyone who'd participated in stealing 8-year-old girl. She died in 1964 at age 72, cancer taking her after a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice for children who'd survived, because mother had been willing to hunt 16 men when legal system had failed to protect families from organized crime. Her obituary mentioned she was mother of Emma, Thomas Jr., and William without reference to September 1928 events that had defined her life. Euphemistic language that avoided celebrating violence while allowing community to remember woman, whose maternal rage had eliminated child trafficking ring that law enforcement had been too corrupt or incompetent to dismantle. The legacy persists in debates about maternal violence and limits of legal protection, about whether killing 16 men could be justified when they'd operated trafficking ring-stealing children, about what mothers will do when defending offspring from threats that authorities can't or won't address. The Kentucky Reaper case demonstrated that maternal instincts create violence exceeding any male aggression when children are threatened, that underestimating women's capacity for systematic campaigns when protecting families carries fatal consequences for criminals and corrupt law enforcement who believe mothers will accept children's return without pursuing accountability for everyone involved in kidnapping operations. The immediate aftermath of Patsey Troxdale's systematic elimination of 16 trafficking ring members created unprecedented situation throughout eastern Kentucky, where families whose children had been kidnapped over previous 3 years finally understood what had happened to sons and daughters they'd been told had run away or died in accidents. The 4 children rescued from farmhouse on September 7th represented only fraction of 18 youngsters who'd been stolen by Webb's gang. 14 others had already been sold to adoption brokers and transported to distant cities where wealthy couples had purchased them believing they were orphans or surrendered babies, rather than kidnapped victims whose families desperately searched for them. Kentucky State Police launched massive investigation in October 1928, attempting to locate 14 missing children and return them to families who'd spent years mourning losses they'd believed were permanent. The investigation revealed trafficking network extending far beyond Harlan County, adoption brokers operating throughout eastern United States, purchasing stolen children from multiple gangs, working in Appalachian regions where poverty and isolation made families vulnerable to kidnapping operations that authorities had attributed to high rates of children running away from hardship. Robert Harrison, adoption broker killed by Patsey on October 12th, had maintained records documenting sales of over 200 children acquired from various trafficking rings across 5 states during a 10-year period. Meticulous business records that treated youngsters as inventory to be purchased wholesale and sold retail to desperate couples who paid premium prices for healthy children without criminal backgrounds or genetic defects that might complicate adoptions. Harrison's records enabled state police to locate 9 of 14 missing Harlan County children during November and December 1928, reuniting families who'd believed their sons and daughters were dead or lost forever. The reunions were bittersweet. Children who'd been kidnapped as 4 or 5-year-olds had spent 3 or 4 years with adoptive families who'd genuinely loved them and who'd believed they were providing homes for orphans, rather than participating in criminal enterprise. Several children had no memory of biological families they'd been stolen from, had bonded with adoptive parents who'd raised them from early childhood, created situations where returning children to biological families meant traumatizing youngsters who'd already suffered kidnapping, and who now faced being separated from only parents they remembered. 5 children were never located despite extensive investigation. Records suggested they'd been sold to families outside United States, transported to Canada or Mexico, where American authorities lacked jurisdiction to recover them, or where adoptive families had resources and connections to avoid detection. The 5 permanently lost children represented continuing tragedy for biological families who'd lost sons and daughters to trafficking ring that Patsey had eliminated, but whose violence couldn't reverse sales that had already occurred before she'd rescued Emma and discovered extent of criminal operation. Mothers and fathers of missing children expressed gratitude to Patsey for ending trafficking that might have claimed additional victims while simultaneously mourning that her campaign had come too late to prevent their own children's permanent disappearance into adoption system. Patsey became a controversial figure throughout eastern Kentucky during late 1928 and early 1929, celebrated by families whose children had been returned as heroes who'd accomplished what law enforcement had failed to achieve, condemned by authorities who viewed her systematic violence as vigilantism that undermined rule of law regardless of whether victims had been criminals and corrupt deputies. Harlan County Sheriff James Bradford, who'd succeeded to position after Webb's death, publicly stated that Patsey should be prosecuted for 16 murders, despite lack of evidence connecting her to killings, argued that allowing vigilante violence to go unpunished would encourage others to take law into own hands when dissatisfied with official justice system. Bradford's position was controversial because everyone knew Webb had been corrupt, and that prosecutors' reluctance to pursue trafficking charges aggressively had created a situation where systematic elimination appeared necessary to protect community from gang that would have continued operating if members hadn't been permanently removed. But Bradford's statements also reflected legitimate concern about precedent that Patsey's unprosecuted violence established. If mothers could kill criminals who threatened children without facing legal consequences, what prevented other individuals from deciding that personal justice through violence was appropriate response to crimes that authorities investigated inadequately? The question became more urgent in January 1929 when father in neighboring county killed man suspected of molesting his daughter cited Patsey's case as precedent that parental violence defending children wouldn't be prosecuted when legal system failed to protect families adequately. Kentucky Attorney General condemned comparison, argued that Patsey's case was unique because she'd faced organized trafficking ring with corrupt law enforcement participation rather than individual criminal who could have been prosecuted through normal judicial processes. The debate about parental violence and legal system failures intensified when 9 children who'd been returned to biological families after years with adoptive parents, began showing severe psychological trauma from being separated from only families they remembered. Several children attempted to run away to return to adoptive homes. Others refused to bond with biological parents they didn't recognize. Some developed behavioral problems, suggesting they'd been more traumatized by forced return than by original kidnapping that had occurred when they'd been too young to remember. Child welfare experts testified before Kentucky legislature in 1930 that returning kidnapped children to biological families wasn't always in youngsters' best interests when years had passed and when adoptive families had provided stable, loving homes, recommended that courts evaluate each case individually rather than automatically returning all kidnapped children, regardless of psychological impact separation would create. The recommendations were controversial because they appeared to suggest that trafficking rings' crimes could be partially excused if adoptive families had treated stolen children well, that kidnapping victims' welfare might require leaving them, with people who'd purchased them from criminal gangs, even if adoptive parents had genuinely believed children were orphans. Biological families whose children had been returned expressed outrage that anyone would suggest their sons and daughters should remain with adoptive families who'd benefited from trafficking operation, regardless of whether they'd knowingly participated in criminal enterprise. Patsey remained silent during these debates, focused on helping Emma recover from 4-day kidnapping ordeal and maintaining household for 3 children whose stability had been disrupted by September events. Emma Troxdale's recovery from kidnapping was complicated by knowledge that mother had killed 16 men to avenge her abduction and eliminate trafficking ring that had stolen her. Emma was 8 years old enough to understand that violence her mother had committed was connected to her kidnapping, young enough to be disturbed by knowing that protecting her had required killing that many people. Patsey attempted to shield Emma from details about systematic elimination campaign, but community gossip and other children's comments meant Emma learned more than mother wanted about how Kentucky Reaper had hunted everyone involved in trafficking operation. Emma developed nightmares about men taking her again, required mother's constant reassurance that she was safe, struggled with guilt about violence that had been committed to rescue and avenge her. Patsey sought advice from a doctor in Lexington, who specialized in childhood trauma, was told that Emma needed consistent message that mother's violence had been necessary to protect her and other children, that adults, not children, bore responsibility for decisions made during crisis, that Emma should understand mother's love had motivated protective actions without being burdened with details about specific killings or tactical planning that had enabled systematic elimination campaign. Patsey followed doctors' recommendations, provided Emma with simplified narrative about needing to stop bad men from taking more children, while avoiding graphic descriptions of how 16 gang members had died. The approach seemed to help. Emma's nightmares decreased gradually through 1929 and 1930, though she remained more anxious and clingy than she'd been before kidnapping. Other families whose children had been rescued or returned from adoptive families struggled with similar challenges, helping youngsters process trauma from kidnapping and subsequent disruptions. Community established informal support network where mothers would gather to discuss children's recovery, share strategies for addressing nightmares and behavioral problems, provide emotional support for families dealing with long-term consequences of trafficking operation that had destroyed sense of safety parents had previously taken for granted. Patsey participated reluctantly in these gatherings, uncomfortable being celebrated as hero when she viewed systematic elimination campaign as necessary protection rather than heroic resistance. Understanding that violence she'd committed had been motivated by maternal rage rather than noble principles about defending community. The gatherings became formalized in 1931 when participants established Harlan County Family Protection Association, organization devoted to preventing future child kidnappings, through improved communication between families and law enforcement, better procedures for investigating missing children cases, advocacy for stronger penalties against trafficking operations. Association lobbied Kentucky legislature for reforms, including mandatory investigation of all child disappearances, prohibition against law enforcement officers having business relationships with adoption brokers, requirement that adoptive parents verify children's backgrounds before completing adoptions. Several recommendations were enacted in 1932 Child Protection Act, landmark legislation that established first comprehensive framework for preventing and investigating child trafficking in Kentucky. But association also became vehicle for glorifying Patsey's violence in ways that made her uncomfortable, members treating her as symbol of maternal protection when she viewed herself as woman who'd done what was necessary rather than model for others to emulate. Association President Sarah Morrison, whose 6-year-old son had been returned from adoptive family in Ohio, gave speeches throughout Kentucky describing how Patsey had saved children that law enforcement had failed to protect, arguing that mothers needed to be prepared to use violence when defending offspring from threats that authorities couldn't address. Patsey asked Morrison privately to stop using her as example, explained that she didn't want to encourage other women to pursue violence when legal remedies might be available, that her situation had been unique because Webb's corruption had made official justice impossible. Morrison agreed to moderate rhetoric, but association's advocacy continued emphasizing that Patsey's campaign had succeeded where legal system had failed, that 16 deaths had been necessary cost of protecting community from trafficking ring that wouldn't have been dismantled through prosecutorial efforts alone. The position was strengthened in 1933 when prosecutor who'd been reluctant to pursue aggressive charges against Webb and his associates was defeated in election by candidate who'd campaigned on promise of holding corrupt law enforcement accountable, who'd cited trafficking ring case as example of how protecting bad deputies undermined public safety and encouraged vigilantism when citizens lost faith in official justice. Patsey maintained low profile through 1930s, devoted herself to raising children and managing homestead where she'd lived since marriage in 1909, avoided publicity about Kentucky Reaper legend that had grown around systematic elimination campaign. Emma graduated from 8th grade in 1936, decided against attending high school because family needed her labor on farm and because continuing education would have required traveling to larger town where she'd be recognized as girl who'd been kidnapped and whose mother had killed 16 men to rescue her. Emma's decision reflected broader challenge for families affected by trafficking ring. Notoriety from case made it difficult to achieve normalcy when everyone knew details about kidnappings and subsequent violence. Emma married in 1940 at age 20, moved to adjacent county, where she and husband established farm away from Harlan County, where kidnapping and rescue had occurred. She maintained close relationship with Patsey throughout life, but preferred to distance herself geographically from location where trauma had originated, understanding that building life required separating herself from events that would always define her identity if she remained in community where everyone knew her as victim, whose mother had become Kentucky Reaper. Emma had 4 children between 1941 and 1950, devoted herself to motherhood with protective intensity that reflected her own experience being kidnapped, maintained household where children were supervised constantly and where strangers were viewed with suspicion that her own kidnapping had justified. Patsey's 2 sons, Thomas Jr. and William, remained in Harlan County through adulthood, both working in coal mines that had employed their father before his death in 1924 collapse. They benefited from mother's legendary status as Kentucky Reaper, found that association with Patsey opened doors throughout region where residents respected woman who'd eliminated trafficking ring when law enforcement had been too corrupt to protect children. Both sons married local women, raised families on properties near Patsey's homestead, provided support that enabled their mother to age independently despite limited income from taking in laundry and selling eggs from chickens she raised. Patsey died November 14, 1964, at age 72. Lung cancer, taking her after a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice for children who'd survived, because mother had been willing to hunt 16 men systematically when legal system had failed to protect families from organized trafficking. Her funeral drew over 800 mourners from throughout eastern Kentucky, testament to legendary status she'd achieved as maternal protector, who'd accomplished what corrupt law enforcement had refused to attempt. Multiple speakers delivered eulogies celebrating Patsey as devoted mother, who'd defended not just her own children, but entire community by eliminating trafficking ring that had stolen 18 youngsters over 3 years, carefully worded tributes that never explicitly acknowledged she'd killed 16 men, but that everyone understood referenced systematic elimination campaign that had defined her life after Emma's kidnapping. Emma delivered final eulogy describing Mother's strength and unwavering protection, acknowledged publicly for first time that Patsey had taken actions necessary to rescue her and prevent future kidnappings when prosecutor had been willing to accept guilty pleas to lesser charges rather than holding Webb and associates fully accountable. Emma's frankness was controversial, even at funeral attended by residents who'd known Patsey's role for 36 years, some believing explicit acknowledgement violated appropriate boundaries about discussing violence, even when everyone understood what had occurred. But Emma argued that Mother deserved recognition for courage and capability that had enabled systematic campaign protecting children when authorities had failed. That maintaining silence after Patsey's death meant allowing history to forget woman whose maternal rage had succeeded where judicial system had been too corrupt or incompetent to deliver protection families needed. Patsey was buried beside husband Thomas in cemetery on family property, simple gravestone listing names and dates without reference to September 1928 events that had transformed her from struggling widow into Kentucky Reaper, whose systematic violence had eliminated trafficking ring. But visitors to cemetery would gather at gravesite, tell stories about mother who'd killed 16 men to rescue daughter, transform Patsey into folk hero, whose legendary status grew with each retelling until separating actual events from embellished narratives became impossible for those who hadn't lived through 1928 and didn't know truth from community legend that celebrated maternal protection through violence that authorities had never successfully prosecuted. The 1970s brought renewed interest in Patsey's story when feminist movement began examining women's capacity for violence when defending families, challenging assumptions about maternal passivity that had dominated cultural narratives about mothers as nurturing caregivers rather than capable protectors willing to use systematic force when children were threatened. Historian Jennifer Morrison published first comprehensive study in 1976 titled The Kentucky Reaper, Maternal Violence and Child Trafficking in 1928 Appalachia, documenting September events through interviews with Emma and surviving community members, examination of state police files that had been declassified after mandatory retention period, analysis of how organized trafficking had operated throughout region during 1920s when poverty and isolation had made families vulnerable to kidnapping operations. Morrison's research revealed that Harrison's adoption brokerage had been part of larger network operating throughout eastern United States, that over 2,000 children had been kidnapped and sold during decade before Patsey's elimination of Harlan County Ring had triggered investigations exposing broader enterprise. The scale was staggering. Trafficking had been industrial operation with multiple gangs supplying children to brokers who maintained sophisticated distribution networks connecting stolen youngsters with wealthy couples willing to pay premium prices for babies and toddlers who could be raised as biological offspring without adoption complications. Morrison estimated that only a fraction of kidnapped children had ever been recovered, that hundreds remained with adoptive families who never learned they'd purchased stolen youngsters rather than legitimate orphans. Morrison's most significant finding came from Webb's personal papers that had been preserved by his widow and donated to Kentucky Historical Society in 1970. Papers documented that Webb had been recruited into trafficking operation in 1925 by senior deputy, who'd established Harlan County branch as part of expansion throughout Appalachian coal regions, where economic hardship made children vulnerable, and where law enforcement corruption enabled operations that required official complicity to function. Webb's recruitment had been motivated by debts from gambling addiction, had accepted position leading local gang because $5,000 payments for each child sold provided income that deputy's salary couldn't match. Papers also revealed Webb's psychological deterioration as operation continued. Early entries expressed guilt about stealing children from families. Later entries showed rationalization, that adoptive parents provided better lives than impoverished biological families could offer. Final entries suggested Webb had convinced himself he was performing social service by redistributing children from poverty to wealth. Morrison's book generated controversy throughout Kentucky, law enforcement organizations condemning it as an attack on fallen deputy who couldn't defend himself, adoption advocates arguing that revealing trafficking networks' extent would traumatize adults who'd been adopted during 1920s and who might now question whether they'd been kidnapped rather than legitimately orphaned. But child welfare organizations embraced research as evidence that child trafficking remained a serious problem, requiring systemic reforms beyond what 1932 legislation had accomplished, that Morrison's documentation of industrial-scale operation demonstrated need for federal intervention, establishing national framework for investigating suspicious adoptions and recovering kidnapped children. Emma Troxdale, who'd been interviewed extensively for Morrison's research, struggled with renewed attention to kidnapping that had occurred 48 years earlier when she'd been 8 years old. Emma was 56 in 1976, grandmother of 12, had spent decades building life separate from events that had defined childhood. Morrison's book meant her grandchildren learned about kidnapping and mother's violence for first time, discovered that grandmother they'd known as gentlewoman devoted to family had been victim whose rescue had required systematic elimination of 16 traffickers. Emma's grandchildren responded differently. Some viewed Patsey as hero who'd protected family. Others were disturbed that their great-grandmother had killed 16 people, regardless of whether violence had been motivated by maternal protection. Emma, granted rare interview in 1977, first extended media appearance since mother's funeral in 1964, spoke about carrying weight of knowing 16 men had died because she'd been kidnapped. She acknowledged that mother's violence had been necessary to end trafficking operation that legal system had failed to dismantle, expressed gratitude that Patsey had possessed courage and capability to rescue her and eliminate gang that would have continued stealing children if members hadn't been permanently removed. But Emma also acknowledged that living with knowledge of violence committed on her behalf had shaped her entire life, had influenced how she'd raised own children with protective intensity that sometimes bordered on obsessive control, had created anxiety about strangers and authority figures that she'd never completely overcome despite decades passing since 4-day kidnapping ordeal. Most significantly, Emma revealed that she'd maintained contact throughout adult life with 3 other children who'd been rescued from farmhouse on September 7th. That group had formed bond through shared experience of being kidnapped and witnessing maternal violence that had followed their rescue. The 4 had gathered annually on September 7th to commemorate rescue and discuss how trafficking and subsequent events had shaped their lives, created support network for addressing psychological impacts that hadn't been recognized or treated adequately during 1920s when childhood trauma wasn't understood as requiring professional intervention. Emma described how gathering had helped her process complex emotions about mother's violence, had provided space to acknowledge both gratitude for rescue and discomfort with systematic elimination that had seemed necessary at time, but that created moral questions as decades passed, and as participants gained adult perspective on events they'd experienced as children. Emma's interview sparked national discussion about children's perspectives on parental violence committed on their behalf, whether youngsters whose rescue or protection required systematic killing bore psychological burdens that complicated simple narratives celebrating maternal heroism. Child psychologists testified before congressional committees examining child trafficking that Emma's experience was common. Children rescued from dangerous situations often developed complicated feelings about violence that had been necessary for their protection, felt gratitude toward rescuers, while simultaneously experiencing guilt about deaths that had occurred on their behalf. The testimony supported legislative proposals for providing mental health services to trafficking victims, acknowledging that rescue was beginning rather than end of recovery process that required ongoing support for addressing trauma. The 21st century brought final chapters in Troxdale family story when documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination of child trafficking ring and Patsey's systematic elimination campaign. The Kentucky Reaper, Maternal Rage and Justice in 1928. Premiered in 2018, featured interviews with historians including Jennifer Morrison, with Emma's children and grandchildren describing how family had been shaped by kidnapping and violence across 3 generations, with descendants of 16 dead gang members expressing continuing anger that Kentucky Reaper had never been prosecuted despite killing their grandfathers and great-grandfathers. Documentary presented most balanced account possible given competing narratives, acknowledged both trafficking rings' horrific crimes and Patsey's systematic violence as components of tragedy where criminal enterprise and maternal vengeance had combined to create suffering extending far beyond immediate participants. Most powerful segment featured joint interview with Rebecca Troxdale, Emma's granddaughter, age 42 in 2018, and Marcus Webb Jr., age 38, great-grandson of Deputy Marcus Webb, who'd led trafficking operation and who'd been killed by Patsey during systematic elimination campaign. Rebecca described growing up knowing great-grandmother had killed 16 people to rescue grandmother, struggling to reconcile family pride in Patsey's protective violence with discomfort about celebrating systematic killing, regardless of whether victims had been criminals. Marcus described how great-grandfather's involvement in trafficking operation had devastated family's reputation for 4 generations, how learning that Webb had stolen children while serving as law enforcement officer had created shame that descendants couldn't escape even 90 years after events. The exchange revealed partial common ground. Both agreed that trafficking operation had been unconscionable crime deserving severe punishment. Both acknowledged that prosecutors' reluctance to pursue aggressive charges had created situation where systematic violence appeared necessary to protect community. But deep disagreements persisted about whether Patsey's campaign had been justified or whether killing 16 people exceeded proportional response, even when victims had operated trafficking ring-stealing children. Rebecca maintained that great-grandmother's violence had been appropriate maternal protection when legal system had failed, that 16 deaths were acceptable cost of ending operation that had stolen 18 children and would have claimed additional victims if gang hadn't been eliminated. Marcus argued that systematic killing was murder regardless of victims' crimes, that Patsey should have trusted judicial process even if prosecutor had initially been reluctant to pursue full accountability. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from newly discovered FBI files showing that several gang members killed by Patsey had been recruited into trafficking operation through coercion, had participated reluctantly because refusing would have endangered their own families when Webb threatened violence against anyone who didn't cooperate with kidnapping operations. Files documented that at least 3 unemployed minors had told confidants they wanted to quit gang but feared Webb would retaliate against their children if they attempted to leave. That participation in trafficking had been motivated by terror rather than greed for $5,000 payments per child. Information complicated narrative that all 16 gang members bore equal culpability suggested Patsey's systematic elimination hadn't discriminated between Webb, who'd recruited operation, and minors who'd participated under duress. Families of coerced gang members were particularly angry that their grandfathers had died, despite being forced participants who'd wanted to escape trafficking operation but had been trapped by Webb's threats against their families. Rebecca Troxdale defended great-grandmother's decision to eliminate all 16 participants, argued that even coerced involvement in child kidnapping deserved death penalty that legal system had failed to impose, that distinguishing between willing and coerced participants would have been impossible during crisis, when priority was ending operation before additional children were stolen. But Emma's son William published response essay, acknowledging that some gang members killed had been victims of Webb's coercion rather than willing criminals, that great-grandmother's violence had exceeded proportional response, even while recognizing that trafficking operation had created impossible situation, where maternal protection required systematic elimination of everyone involved. The revelation sparked intense debate within Troxdale family about how Patsey's legacy should be remembered, whether celebrating Kentucky Reaper required ignoring that some victims had participated under duress, whether honoring great-grandmother meant defending all her actions, or acknowledging moral complexity that made simple heroic narratives inadequate. Debate reflected generational differences. Older family members who'd known Patsey personally maintained traditional position that systematic elimination had been necessary, maternal protection. Younger generation, more willing to question whether killing coerced participants had been justified, or whether great-grandmother's campaign had been motivated partly by rage exceeding defensive necessity. By 2024, Patsey Troxdale's grave had become pilgrimage site for anti-trafficking activists and maternal rights advocates, location where visitors could confront reality that child trafficking had been industrial operation throughout 1920s, and that one mother's systematic violence had accomplished what corrupt law enforcement had refused to attempt. Tour guides presented complicated narrative, acknowledging both trafficking rings' horrific scale and Patsey's problematic violence, neither celebrating Kentucky Reaper as unambiguous hero, nor condemning her as murderer, but recognizing that her actions existed in moral complexity, where legitimate maternal protection didn't fully justify killing 16 people, including some who'd participated under coercion. Historical marker at graveside captured irreducible complexity. Patsey Troxdale systematically killed 16 men involved in child trafficking operation that had stolen 18 children, including her daughter Emma, in 1928. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb led gang that sold kidnapped youngsters to adoption brokers for $5,000 per child. Prosecutors' reluctance to pursue aggressive charges created situation where maternal violence appeared necessary to protect community. Several gang members participated under coercion, threatened with violence against own families if they refused Webb's orders. Patsey's campaign ended trafficking operation that law enforcement had been too corrupt to dismantle. But systematic elimination raised questions about whether all 16 deaths were justified or whether some victims bore limited culpability. This grave reminds us that child trafficking creates situations where maternal protection requires violence, that corrupt law enforcement enables crimes against children, and that systematic elimination campaigns raise moral questions even when motivated by legitimate defensive necessity. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of maternal violence across 96 years, the child trafficking ring that stole 18 youngsters and sold them for $5,000 each, the prosecutor who protected corrupt deputies rather than pursuing accountability, the 16 gang members, including some coerced participants who died in systematic elimination campaign, the rescued children's lifelong psychological burden knowing violence was committed on their behalf, the impossible questions about whether killing all 16 was justified or whether maternal rage exceeded proportional response when some victims had limited culpability. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories that force examination of what maternal protection requires when legal systems fail children, that acknowledge both horrific trafficking operations and problematic violence that eliminates them, that demonstrate how defending offspring creates moral complexity when systematic campaigns kill people bearing varying degrees of responsibility. Comment about whether Patsey was justified killing all 16 participants or should have discriminated between Webb and coerced minors. Whether Emma's lifelong guilt about violence committed for her rescue represents predictable consequence of parental protection through systematic elimination, whether contemporary anti-trafficking movement should celebrate Kentucky Reaper as symbol or acknowledge moral problems with lionizing systematic killer, regardless of maternal motivations. Because these questions persist wherever trafficking threatens children, wherever corrupt law enforcement enables rather than prevents crimes, wherever maternal instincts create violence exceeding what judicial systems can or will deliver, wherever celebrating protective violence requires ignoring victims who participated reluctantly under coercion. Until next time, remember that Patsey Troxdale killed 16 men to rescue daughter from trafficking ring that had stolen 18 children for profit. That prosecutor had been willing to accept lesser charges against corrupt deputies rather than pursuing full accountability, that some gang members had participated under coercion with threats against own families, that Emma lived entire adult life knowing systematic violence had been committed on her behalf, and that ultimately, maternal protection creates moral complexity when defending children requires killing people whose culpability varies from leadership to coerced participation, that honoring protective violence means acknowledging, rather than dismissing questions about whether all deaths were justified or whether rage exceeded necessity.